This is an advanced installation. It requires welding and fabrication skills.
So if you're not comfortable welding, find a qualified welder or work with someone who is. Hey y'all, I'm David with Willomet Motor and Fab.
I'm Steven with Offroad Design.
And this is the 4th episode in a series talking about how to put together the front coilover and link system for your square body. Remember last time we put together all of the tubing, engine cage, and now the coilovers are in and the truck can sit on its own weight. But before we go and start test driving this, there's a pretty decent little checklist we need to go through to make sure that your truck is ready to safely operate and test all these new whiz-bang parts that you got on there.
In the course of this install, you have disturbed most of the systems on your truck. All of these things, if they weren't important, they wouldn't be there. They need to be checked, possibly double checked, make sure everything's okay. We're gonna go through some details for things to check over, but at the end of this, it's your responsibility to make sure that your truck is safe to operate. Please put the time into that. We don't want to have any problems.
So we've developed a small list, and in no particular order, here's kind of some of the things that we think are pretty common. Your installation varies because only you really understand your engine and transmission and all the packaging under hood, but these are some common things. Your results might vary depending on your install up to this point. I think probably the most obvious is your inner fender wells. You've had to at least cut a hole out of them or remove them and filled some new ones entirely.
And this is a concern for a lot of people at the front end of this, is can I keep my inner fender wells, because they are important in keeping mud and everything out of the engine bay. At the very least, a simple slot in the inner fender well will let the coilover come through and works just fine. It doesn't have to be removing the whole thing. You can go as far as starting completely over and fabricating out from there, but a simple slot is really all that it takes to make it happen.
Yeah. The next item really is a safety note. Brake lines might sit really close to where your coilover or the tubing is, and you may need to rebend or move the brake lines that you have. So do that very, very carefully, paying attention to all the flares and that everything is a consistent radius and no kinks or anything like that.
Right. Something that should come out when you're cycling it is making sure that the brake lines don't stretch when they're at full droop. Something that's not as obvious is making sure that they go back the same place every time when you compress. Because when you were cycling it, that brake line may have pushed out of the way one direction, but if there's not something to hold it there, it can push back another direction and get pinched in a coil or pinched against the frame. So this is where a lot of times you'll see our trucks with a small spring or a bungee cord that holds several components. It can be your breather lines, your hydraulic lines. All of these have to follow a consistent path to be safe. And this is a chance to put a small bungee cord on those to make sure that they go to the position that they need to every single time. Brake lines probably being the most important of those lines, but not like steering lines and breathers and air locker lines are not all important also.
Right. Next, under your hood, as you've put all this stuff together, undoubtedly there's a hose that's going to move and may rub up against something. If that hose is carrying oil or fuel or anything along those lines, do a double and triple check, because the last thing you want to have is a hose that will rub, and it'll rub faster than you think, and now start an accidental fire or something along those lines. We talked about how the suspension might still need some adjustment if you're not really quite at the right height you want. And the cool thing is coilovers are adjustable, both in terms of your spring rate and the placement of the spring on the body of the shock. So by placing your suspension at full droop, you can actually move and adjust the adjuster nut to push the suspension up and down.
That's right. This is not a place to go super in depth about how to adjust this single feature. There's details in the instructions, and we could talk for an hour about spring rates on a truck. But the big thing is, you never want to have the coils be free at full droop, and you want to run typically no more than about 2 inches of preload. If you get to that point, it's time to start thinking about changing springs. Once again, go through the instructions here to check out more specifically how to go through that process if that happens. For now, to get the truck ready to drive, you can put an inch to 2 inches of preload on it and be ready to go.
One last detail before you go and drive. all these shocks come uncharged from the factory, and they need a good gas in them. The best gas being 150 to 200 pounds of nitrogen. There are other sources of air that are okay. Really, really clean shop air is okay. CO2 is also a dry gas, but nitrogen is the best. So if you can find a place to fill your shocks with nitrogen installed on the truck, then you're doing really great. Last detail, and it's not a trivial one, nut and bolt, everything. Stuff you touched, stuff that you think you might need to, just do a double and triple check on those, because those are safety items before you go and do a test drive.
Even things that you don't think you messed with, check your lug nuts, the rear lug nuts. Maybe you didn't even pull the rear tires that you remember, but we've lost tires and you don't want to do that. Check them all over.
So at this point, now you're ready to test, put your truck on the ground and find yourself a place to go around the block and just make sure that things work. On completion of your successful test drive, you'll come back and you'll go through all of these nuts and bolts and double check these things again. Remember, this is the first time that your truck is driven with this brand new suspension. And quite frankly, you just have a brand new truck. And so there's a lot to go and learn and become familiar with. Now that you've got a whole lot of great free travel and laser precise steering, we're gonna talk about some other systems on your truck may also be ripe for upgrades. And that's what we're gonna look at next time when we take a look at some of the rear suspension pieces for custom leaf springs, sway bars, and shock tuning.
At this point, it's time to go start having fun with it. Enjoy the ride.
That was a good one.
Synchronization complete.
Yeah.